Another episode of Joy Meets World. I am your host, Joy Yuki, and on this podcast, I am talking about my adventures traveling around the U.S. with my dog Quincy, visiting our national parks. And today I'm going to tell you about my trip and my tours through Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. So we left off in Crestone, Colorado, which is in southern Colorado. I was visiting the Great Sand Dunes National Park, hit a pretty bad dust storm, which actually I found out later left a crack in my windshield. Not a bad one. It's a surface one, so hopefully it doesn't get worse. But yes, there's a little crack in my windshield above visible level. From Crestone, Colorado, I actually traveled to Boulder, Colorado. It took me about 6 hours to cover 200 miles. I went to Boulder because my friend Emily lives there, and I met up with her to have some coffee and chat and get some human interaction time at a little bookstore / coffee shop called Trident Coffee in downtown Boulder. So that was really fun, really nice. The parts of the drive up, so I had to leave super early in the morning around 5:30 to get up to Boulder for some mid-morning coffee. And I did. The windstorm was not quite gone. There were still gusts of wind. It wasn't blowing dirt, but it was a little bit gusty. And then in the peaks and the passes of the Rockies that I went through, there was a little bit of snow, a little bit of flurries. But then it would go away as I went into the valleys. So nothing terrible. Once I left Boulder, I actually traveled about 2.5 hours northwest to Grand Lake, Colorado, which is right outside of Rocky Mountain National Park. It's like a mile from the entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. So I went about 108 miles. It was probably the scariest drive I've ever done in my life. The first part of the drive, it was sunny and 70 degrees, and we were going through this mountain canyon, essentially. And I probably went through about 7 tunnels in that first hour of the trip. And then essentially, looking back at the drive, I went over a giant mountain via switchbacks up, very narrow switchbacks up, and then very narrow switchbacks down the other side of the mountain. And as soon as I hit the mountain, it started snowing really hard. It was a whiteout. So we're going up this mountain doing really scary switchbacks, going really slow. Thankfully, the snow was not sticking most of the time. So the roads are wet, but there was not like slush or accumulating snow on the ground. It was definitely coming down harder the farther up I went, which makes sense. Definitely holding my breath, just being very careful of other cars who were going slower, who were going faster, who were pulled over. When I had reached the top of the mountain, the snow started sticking, and that's when I knew I was in trouble, that I had to get out of it fast, but not by speeding up. Just something had to change. And so I just focused really hard and concentrated and just took deep breaths and got through it. And as soon as I hit the other side of the mountain, it was still snowing, but it stopped sticking. It didn't snow as hard. It wasn't a whiteout like I was on the mountain. You could definitely see far ahead. And then about half an hour before I got to Grand Lake, Colorado, it stopped completely, and the roads were actually dry. So they didn't get any snow at all. It was just sunny and 70 again. So complete bipolar weather patterns in the Rockies. And then, in the couple of days I spent in Grand Lake, it would snow about once a day, usually in the evening for about an hour to 3 hours. But then in the next 24 hours, it would completely melt. The weather was in the 40s and sunny. And so everything would melt, and then it would snow again. And then everything would melt, and it would snow again. So very interesting. It was the Airbnb I stayed at was on sort of this hillside, this mountain beside the lake. And so you had this beautiful view of the entire lake and the mountains around it, which were covered in snow. Half of the lake was frozen, half of it was melted. Just a really cool time of year to be there, and to see that view was amazing. The national park, the visitor centers were all closed. The roads were actually clear. It's that time of year where they change the status of the roads and what you are or aren't allowed to drive on by the day. You have to follow their Twitter page to find that. They don't require a fee to enter the park. But most of the trails were still covered in snow or burned. So nowhere around where I was staying my Airbnb did I notice any burned foliage, but as soon as you pulled onto the main road and like past the Rocky Mountain National Park sign, like it was just burnt foliage everywhere, just black tree trunks everywhere. So there was a fire there, and that had affected a lot of the trails because they haven't gone in for spring cleaning essentially yet. And so a lot of the trails are affected by that and really aren't passable because of the snow and then the fire damage. So Grand Lake was great. From there, I traveled to Custer, South Dakota, which is 400 miles northeasterly. It took me 7 hours, so one of my longer drives. I stayed in this brand new cabin with a loft. It was new. The host came over and talked to me for 15 minutes. Really kind people. And it was this huge property. South Dakota, of course, is all prairie, so it's just beautiful. I got some Little House on the Prairie vibes while I was there. And then right surrounding the cabin is this, basically the rest of the property is fenced in. And they have 2 horses, Cisco and Dakota, who just wander around at all hours of the day, just doing their thing. And so sometimes I would just look out the window and I could see horses. I could go up and pet them and talk to them. So it was really sweet. They also had miles and miles of horse trails on the property. So Quincy and I got to hike and walk a lot, which was so much fun. It was great to be outside. The weather was actual spring weather. It was in the 60s and sunny with like a breeze. So it was wonderful to be outside. Custer, South Dakota is 20 minutes from Wind Cave National Park. It's about a 45-minute drive to Mount Rushmore and the Crazy Horse Memorial. So if you've never heard of the Crazy Horse Memorial, my friend Julie Tilson told me about this. I didn't know about it before I came to South Dakota, but I'm so glad she told me. So the Crazy Horse Memorial is depicting the Native American leader by the same name. And it is going to be bigger than Mount Rushmore. It's basically this man on a horse pointing, but it's going to be huge. I encourage you to go look it up and see what it looks like, what it is going to look like when it's going to be finished. They have basically the head and maybe part of the arm done, and it's going very, very slow because it's completely privately funded and privately operated, so it's not a state or a federal project. It doesn't receive any of their money. It just depends on, donations and private funding, which means it goes a lot slower because there's a lot less of it. And there's a smaller team working on it. But it's going to be beautiful and massive. And if you're in the area, I encourage you to go see it. Again, it's only 10 minutes from Mount Rushmore. I think 40 minutes from Custer. Mount Rushmore was amazing. I'm so glad I stopped to see it. I'm so glad I got to see it. It's been on my bucket list. It was just really neat to see. I didn't know that Thomas Jefferson had actually been on the left side of George Washington originally, and then they moved him to the right side of George Washington. So that was interesting to find out. It's amazing just the detail, like Teddy Roosevelt's glasses that they put into the rock. It's just insane that they can do that with such a large space and rough material. It was awesome, truly awesome to look at, and I'm so glad I got to see it. I'm so glad. Check that off my bucket list. Definitely worth seeing. Wind Cave National Park was just a lot cooler than I expected. I'm not a huge cave person. I've come to find out when I toured Carlsbad Caverns back earlier this year, and I go ahead and listen to that episode if you want. I just realized my claustrophobia kicks in too much in those small spaces, and I really have to focus not to panic too much. So I don't hate caves, and obviously I went into this one, but they're not my favorite. So I wasn't totally looking forward to Wind Cave, but I didn't. It's one of those national parks I don't know a ton about, so I was so curious to learn about it. I will say there are no self-guided cave tours, and you do have to reserve spaces on each cave tour. So make sure you do that well ahead of time if you're planning to go. One of the best parts about Wind Cave is that, right, it's on the prairie. It's a part of the prairie, and so the animals that I saw. So I saw wolf cross the road. There were buffalo everywhere, and I guess they're in that time of year, spring, right, where they start like shedding their winter coats because they were all rubbing against the signposts and the trees, and their coats, which are really, really thick. When I saw them at Yellowstone maybe a couple of weeks ago, they're like patchy and mangy looking, like they're coming off. So it's always awesome to me to see buffalo. I think they're so cool. And I got to see prairie dogs, which I didn't know was on my bucket list until I saw them. But as I was driving to the cave, there were all these little rodents in the road, like here and there, and then across the prairie. And I couldn't figure out, for the first minutes what I was looking at, like tiny little groundhogs, I thought. And then as soon as I had that thought, it occurred to me that they're prairie dogs. And then you could look out across the prairie and see like the polka dot, like the reddish polka dots of their burrows. So they were everywhere in South Dakota. Wherever there was prairie, there were these little prairie dogs. And I tried to get pictures and photos, but they're too fast. They run away and they're too small, so you really can't get them on camera. You have to see them in person. It's amazing. Wind Cave is actually the area in South Dakota that it's located in was originally Lakota Native American property. And so they originally found the cave. The natural entrance is tiny. They said a man shimmied down there like in the 1800s, the first white settlers who came to the area and found it. Like somebody actually was able to go down there. I couldn't even see how a small child could fit into the natural opening, but that's what happened. And then the white settlers blasted a hole in the side to create a bigger opening to go exploring it. But the Lakotas have their kind of, it's called like an emergent story or their creation story, that starts in the cave. Essentially, that was like heaven and where all the people came from, which is interesting. And it's a really, really interesting history from that point on. But essentially, the Lakotas there's no evidence that they ever went into the cave, but they knew there was a cave down there because wind would blow so hard out of the opening that they knew there must be space down there. They knew there must be a cave. And that's where the cave gets its name. Wind Cave gets its name. It's a barometric cave and a dry cave. So it doesn't have stalactites and stalagmites like other caves. There's no dripping water. There's no water system around it. It's a completely dry cave, and then it responds. Barometric means it responds to the outside air pressure. And so if the outside air pressure is high, it's low in the cave, and vice versa. And in those instances, it will blow air out of the cave to try and restore the balance between the different pressure systems. And so wind will blow in or blow out. They have airlocks to try and make that entrance wind not as strong. They said that without the airlocks back in, I think, the 30s, they gauged the wind coming out of the cave at 70 miles per hour. The highest with the airlocks has been 35 miles per hour, so still pretty strong and pretty crazy. But essentially, the cave was discovered by these settlers. The South Dakota Mining Company, hired them to come and look for gold in the cave because the surrounding kind of granite and the Black Hills had a lot of gold. And so they thought the cave might have gold, but it's made of sandstone, and so it doesn't. But the one member of the family who was a teenager, he kind of fell in love with discovering the cave and mapping it with a string and a bucket lantern, which is like a bucket turned sideways with a candle in it. And I could never do that. Like, it's so dark in there without the lights on, which I will get to. I don't know how this kid loved doing it. So he did that for 3 years, and then it's really sad. He died from typhoid fever. And the family got into a squabble with the mining company and a local hotel about who really owned the cave. Because at that point they were giving tours to make money because they couldn't mine gold. So everyone kind of wanted the profits from the tourism, and it went to court, and the court decided in 1903 that nobody could have it, that the federal government was going to take it and preserve it and make it a national park. And so Teddy Roosevelt signed it into law that it was a national park in 1903. He actually never visited the park, even though he was big on South Dakota and North Dakota. North Dakota has Teddy Roosevelt National Park, and then he spent a lot of time in the Badlands, which is in South Dakota, but he actually never went to Wind Cave National Park, which is interesting, but he knew a lot about it. One of his friends was the caretaker when he named it a national park. So that's kind of the history of Wind Cave National Park. It's the 7th national park in the U.S., and the first one that's a cave. The tours, I did the Garden of Eden tour and the natural entrance tours, which are kind of on opposite sides of the cave. They are still exploring the cave, so they think they've only discovered 7% of the cave. They think it's one of the biggest cave systems in the world, or it will be if they once they discover all of it. And what's kind of crazy about it is that there are layers to it. So there's a top layer of cave systems and mazes, and then there's a middle layer, and then there's a bottom layer, which is really scary to me. They said the teams that come down from the National, I think, Geologic Society or Speleologic Society, which is just a fancy word for caving, they'll come in every 2 weeks to do these, go out and discover new caves inside the cave, right? And they stay in there for 3 days, 3 or 4 days, inside the cave. They camp out because it takes them from the top to get to the very bottom where the last part of the cave has been explored, and to start exploring more. From the top to the bottom, it takes 8 hours to get there. So they set up a camp at the bottom and then go and discover more cave from there, which I could not do. That makes me nauseous, so somebody can stay underground that long, but good for you. That must be my claustrophobia talking. It was, both tours were group tours. There was about 30 people in the first one, maybe 40 people in the second one, so it was nice to have a bunch of people together and a ranger there. The Wind Cave has 90% of the world's boxwork, which is a cave formation, and it's very hard to describe. They named it boxwork because they said it looked like old-timey post office boxes. That's accurate, but it's not the most accurate. Go look up boxwork online because it's very interesting. Essentially, this gypsum salt it was soft, and over time it soaked up water, expanded, cracked the rocks around it, and then this harder calcite came in and like filled in the cracks. And then water came up and like melted all the stuff around the cracks, but it couldn't like wear away. The acid in the water couldn't wear away the calcite that was in the cracks. And so it left like, it's essentially filled in cracks without the stuff around it. I don't know how to describe it to you. It's very, very cool. The like really delicate stuff they call lace work, and then there's also frost work in this cave, which just looks like frost, but it's rock. So that's kind of the cool stuff you can see. One of the freakiest things that they did in this cave was that at both points in the tour, they turned off the lights completely, the cave lights, and so you were just standing in the dark. So the first time they did this, the cave ranger just did not really prepare us. Maybe it's just me, but she was just like, I'm turning off the lights, and then she made everyone, she's like, nobody's allowed to talk, and everyone has to put their cell phones away, to like give us a natural feeling what the cave was like. But she didn't say how long the lights were going to be off. Like, anyway, freaked out because they were off for a solid minute, which feels like a really long time when you cannot see or hear anything and you're claustrophobic. So I came very close to having a panic attack. I was not happy with that because she did not talk us through it at all. The second time on the second tour, the park ranger did. He turned off the lights. Some people had like their cell phones out, so it wasn't pitch black. You could kind of see around, but you still got the idea. And he talked the whole time. So he talked us through it, and it was probably only dark for about 15 seconds. And then he lit the bucket candle, which is kind of like an old-timey flashlight. It's really cute, but still very, very dim and terrifying for the cave. So just be prepared for that if you go. They're going to leave you in pitch blackness. I met a little 3.5-year-old on the tour who wanted to hold my hand for part of the time while we were walking. So sweet and so cute. Made my day. And the tours were about an hour each, so really not bad at all. I liked it a lot. I liked seeing the cave. I liked learning about it. I liked seeing the prairie. Honestly, I really like South Dakota a lot. I can't name the exact reason, but I just like it a lot. And maybe it would be different if I was here at a different time of year, like the winter. So I'm here in May, beginning of May, and it's just kind of getting into spring, and there's no snow, so you can really see everything. So I don't know if that's it or if it's another reason, but I really like South Dakota so far. Can't wait to tell you more about it. Going to the Badlands next, and so I'm excited to share with you about that next time. If you have any questions, you can just go to my Instagram at @JoyYugi and comment on any of my posts or my reels. Or, you can watch this on my YouTube channel, find my name, and the video will be there. I would love if you would subscribe to this podcast, rate it, review it. That really helps other people who are interested in the national parks or in Wind Cave National Park find it. But yeah, until next time. I wish you happy travels wherever life is taking you.